Hello and welcome to my channel, Rhino here. Today I'm looking at another video by Todd Friel of Wretched. This video is called How to Persuade an Atheist Christianity is Real. I assume that by real he actually means true, as I'm fairly certain that the vast majority of atheists will agree that Christianity is a thing that really exists. So under that assumption, I'm expecting that by the end of this video, I will be a Christian. Okay, no, I'm not. I'm expecting some of the same arguments that you always get from apologists. Those arguments that only have a chance on working on people who have just a passing familiarity with the subject matter, as the more you learn about the subject, the less compelling those arguments become. So let's go!
What other holy book would be as honest as Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 when he said, if this event didn't happen, forget about it? I'm paraphrasing, of course.
Now, the question here is, was that a holy book being honest? Or was that just a guy, namely Paul, writing a letter to a congregation that he was familiar with in order to correct what he saw as misconceptions spreading among them? In context, he's directly responding to Christians claiming that there is no resurrection of the dead, referring to the belief that God would one day raise everyone from the dead to pass judgment on them. Side note, Google has recently shifted their spell check to a version that varies by region, so I can choose American English or British English. This is annoying because Canadian English is a weird hybrid of the two, so no matter which I choose, I get these little red squigglies telling me that I'm using the wrong spelling for my region. And apparently Americans spelled judgment without the E after the G, so judgment? I refuse to believe that. I get why y'all have an issue with our extra U's that aren't really necessary, but that E is making the G soft. It's a necessary part of the word to make it all make sense. Okay, back on topic. Paul was responding to people claiming that this end times resurrection of the dead would not happen. And Paul responds by saying that if there is no resurrection of the dead, then Jesus didn't rise from the dead. And if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, then what's the point in even being a Christian? So this is an argument not for the resurrection of Jesus, but rather using the fact that the people he's talking to already believe in the resurrection of Jesus to argue for the resurrection of everyone else at the final judgment. It's also notable that this view is not common among Christians today. The common view is that everyone gets judged immediately after death, so the final resurrection happens right away. You don't have to wait for the final judgment day. So right here, we have an issue where modern Christian beliefs are not reflected in the writings of their founder. But they really do love to pick out this one verse in the middle here while ignoring all its surrounding context.
The resurrection of Jesus Christ is the linchpin miracle in the Bible. Perhaps you're thinking, well, what about the incarnation? When Jesus Christ, God, became flesh.
I mean, I guess that depends on why you would consider any particular miracle to be the linchpin, but I'd agree that the resurrection is the linchpin because of that whole thing where the resurrection was the payment for sins that grants forgiveness to everyone who wants it. The incarnation would merely be the prerequisite in that case.
The problem with saying that's the linchpin miracle is you can't look at a baby and know that the miracle happened.
You're not wrong, but that's not really the main problem with considering that the linchpin. But I'm getting the impression that when you say linchpin, what you actually mean is most impressive. In which case, I'm not even sure if the resurrection of Jesus would make the top 10. God raises people from the dead all the time, and in this case, it's made even easier because the guy being raised from the dead is himself a god, so it's not like you'd expect him to be killable in the first place. You know, because he's a god? Raising humans is way harder, they decompose and stuff, but that happens fairly regularly in the Bible. The flood is also more impressive. It breaks a bunch of the laws of physics. Resurrection, if the body is fresh enough, is hypothetically possible, scientifically speaking. We have a hard time even figuring out exactly when a person should be considered dead, because there are a lot of conditions from which a person can be resuscitated that, as recently as a few decades ago, would have been considered the moment of death. So the idea that a brain could be brought back to a functioning state in a fresh corpse is far less remarkable than breaking all the known laws of physics to flood the world. Same goes for that time he stopped the sun and moon in order to give Joshua more time to finish his genocide. All this to say that I'm not even sure what he means when he says linchpin, because he doesn't seem to be focusing on the purpose behind it, but some other undefined aspect of it.
You would say, well, his life testifies that he is God. I would agree to that.
I would not, and I don't know any atheist that would, and you're purporting to explain how to persuade an atheist, so maybe skip ahead to the persuasive bits?
But the incarnation cannot really be observed, but the resurrection of Jesus Christ can, and it was.
Allegedly. And it can't be observed now. As young Earth creationists are so fond of pointing out, we can't recreate historical events. And while there is plenty of physical evidence that allows us to reconstruct the events that creationists like to deny, there is zero evidence of a similar nature that would allow us to reconstruct the resurrection. Merely stories written down decades after the fact.
Your entire life, your eternity is riding on this miracle, but we need to do some math. How do we even know about this miracle? Well, there was a book written about it. It's called the Bible, and that means you and I are relying on some eyewitnesses to be telling the truth.
Not a single word of the Bible was written by anyone who even claimed to be an eyewitness to the resurrection. Unless we count Paul, who claimed to have had a vision of Jesus, but that's hardly an eyewitness to the event of the resurrection itself, even if I grant every detail of his account of his encounter with Jesus. Though really I shouldn't count those descriptions as being written by Paul, since the detailed descriptions of his encounter with Jesus are only found in Acts, which was written by the same author who wrote Luke, not Paul. And in fact, Paul pretty much explicitly says that his visions are not of a risen man in his letter to the Galatians, where he says, "For I did not receive it from any man, nor was I taught it, but I received it through a revelation of Jesus Christ." That does not sound like a guy who witnessed a man come back from the dead. That sounds like a guy who had a decidedly non-corporeal vision.
How do we know? You'll hear this slanderous accusation when you witness on university campuses. Well, other books get people to believe a lie.
I mean, not in response to what you've said so far. That one comes in mostly when people are asked to demonstrate that the stuff in the Bible is true, and that demonstration comes in the form of quoting the Bible. It's not that other books get people to believe in a lie, it's the fact that the Bible is not the only book that says it is true while containing demonstrably false things.
There's people who have been charlatans. What about Jim Jones?
Did Jim Jones write a book? Yeah, he wrote a booklet, so sure, I guess.
Valid point, but that is why we need to dig deep into these eyewitness biblical accounts.
Eyewitnesses.
You keep using the word. I do not think it means what you think it means.
How about before we dig deep into these eyewitness accounts, we first dig deep into the question of whether or not we even have eyewitness accounts? Because I think you'll find that the answer is we don't.
And what we are going to see is something unique from every other myth story.
Is the unique thing that there are 4 mutually exclusive accounts that are commonly smashed together by people who claim that they are all in perfect harmony with one another? Because I do know of no other book with such a feature.
Let's dive in to our eyewitness accounts to see if indeed they are something that can be trusted. From Nathan Booznitz.
I hate the way he pauses like 1 or 2 words before finishing a sentence, and then he rushes into the next sentence after the pause. It makes it really hard to find interjection points. But I would argue that no, they cannot be trusted. They may be loosely based on real events, but they are so far removed from those events that I doubt their reliability, especially for the magical details of the story. The idea that they may have been based upon the teachings of a guy who did teach at least some of the things that the Jesus character of the Bible is taught is believable. But if we are to accept things like his healing miracles, or his resurrection, or anything remarkable really, we'd need more than we have. A lot more.
The written eyewitness accounts were in circulation much too early to be a myth.
There were reports of Elvis being alive within months of his death, including photographic evidence, such as this photo taken in December, a mere 4 months after his death. This is a photo of a man who looks like he could be Elvis, sitting in Elvis Pool House. Hell, just look at the goddamn 2020 US election. That's kind of the perfect example nowadays, and it works just as well whether you believe it was legitimate or not. On election day itself, before the votes were done being counted, you already had millions of people believing it was fraudulent, and millions believing it was not. One of those positions is true, one is a myth, and it happened immediately. Why? Because people were primed to believe it. If we are taking the gospel accounts at their word, Jesus most definitely primed his disciples to be prepared for him to come back after he died. So the idea that stories were circulating about his return after he died are not unexpected, even right away.
This is huge. Why? Because if they had been written much later, all that time, people could have concocted stories. But when the eyewitness accounts were written near the event, there are people who could have busted the authors.
It's cute that in this day and age you think that fact-checking would actually work against something like this. The election was stolen narrative has been well and thoroughly debunked, and it's easy enough to find that information, and it even came from some of Trump's own officials. But people even today, a year and a half later, insist that not only was the election rigged, but that Trump is somehow still the actual president. And we're still closer to the event than the earliest New Testament writing. Some think that the creed in 1 Corinthians 15 can get back to within months of the crucifixion, but in the published literature, the early estimates put it at about 5 years after the crucifixion. And even then, it wasn't written down until Paul put it down some 20 years after the fact, around 50 CE. So the fact that we are currently living in a time where a massive myth exists that began immediately after the event that it mythologized completely deflates this argument.
Hey, he didn't rise from the dead. Everybody in Jerusalem knows that, but our eyewitness accounts were written close enough to the actual events. And guess what? Nobody said, you're fibbing.
How do you know that nobody said that? Do you know how many pagan counter-apologetics books there are that we only know about from the writings of the Christian apologists who responded to them? How many more oppositions to Christianity were written that just disappeared into the void of history, either through accident or intentional destruction? We don't know, and can never know. And that's to say nothing of the opposition that might have come from the over 90% of the population that didn't know how to read or write, and so would not have written the accounts that would have made it into the history books in the first place.
More details on the nearness of the accounts. A myth cannot be developed when people who can refute it are still alive.
Please refer back to my earlier discussion on the 2020 election. I've made my position on the matter clear, but no matter which side you accept, you surely know that there are people still alive that can refute the version of events that you don't accept. I mean, one side has to lie in order to do that, but there are demonstrable refutations of the idea that the election was rigged. So how has this myth developed if that is not possible? And in the case of Jesus, how do we even know that the people who could refute it were even exposed to it in the first place? Do we know that everyone involved in the story was, at some point, told the story of the resurrection before their death? Caiaphas is said to have died a mere 3 years after the date, in Crete, so not long after the events, and in a different geographical area. How do we know that he even learned of the beginnings of the Christian movement? Now, how about Pilate? Well, I doubt he would have cared even if he did know, but again, he was removed from governorship some 3 years after the fact, so it's entirely conceivable that he was unaware of the existence of Christians in those 3 years. And that's to say nothing of the fact that we know that the Jews of the time were aware of Christianity, and though they may or may not have outright refuted the claims at the beginning, they did eventually take actions against the Christian. In fact, the dating of such action, and the response found in the Gospel of John, is one of the ways we have dated the Gospel of John.
Number 2, many witnesses were still alive when Paul wrote 1 Corinthians in about AD 55, give or take.
Yes, according to Paul, when he wrote down the creed in 1 Corinthians at least 20 years after Jesus died, there were still many witnesses alive, and you can even go check with them if you don't believe me. Who are they? Fucked if I know. They're never named. 20 years ago, my grandmother came back from the dead just after her funeral. 500 people saw it, and if you don't believe me, you can go check with them. Of course, I'm not going to give any details that would possibly identify them. You'll just have to go to Caledon and ask around. There. This is about 20 years after the fact, and I have just written down that there were many witnesses, most of whom are still alive. If you don't find this claim to be credible, then do you see my problem with Paul's claim? Especially given the fact that I'm telling you that you can personally travel to a specific place and check with people in a time when airplanes exist. So it would be inconvenient, but doable. You're asking me to believe a similar claim, but made to people who lived 2,000 years ago, and you seem confident in the assumption that the people living in Corinth would have just dropped everything to make that incredibly long and inconvenient and expensive trip to Jerusalem in order to check up on these 500 unnamed individuals? Sorry, but I'm not terribly impressed. Especially when one of the earliest attacks against Christianity from people like Celsus was that Christianity appealed to the poor and the slaves, and it went out of its way to recruit such people. And Origen of Alexandria, in Against Celsus, responded with an emphatic yes, Christianity is indeed for such people. So, by all accounts, most early Christians were poor or slaves. And these people of limited means were supposed to make the 2,000-kilometer journey from Corinth to Jerusalem in a time when the fastest mode of transportation were horses? I don't think so.
Number 3, many witnesses were still alive when Paul wrote Galatians in AD 49, and he certainly talks about Christ rising from the dead.
Yeah, I mean, he wrote Galatians around the same time as he wrote Corinthians, so yes, if they were alive when he wrote Corinthians, then they were likely also alive when he wrote Galatians. The exact same response applies here. In fact, one of the things I like about the book of Galatians is that it illustrates just how little we know about what might have been contained in the original documents that the books of the Bible are supposedly based on, because Galatians was likely dictated. We know this from Galatians 6:11. See with what large letters I am writing to you with my own hand. That was a standard method for dictation at the time to protect against forgeries that claimed to be in the wrong handwriting because they were dictated. The person doing the dictating would write a short bit at the end, pointing out the distinctive features of their handwriting for you to compare to other letters you've received from them. Now, Galatia was a region, not a city, and it had a few Christian congregations. So, was this one letter copied and sent to multiple congregations? Did Paul dictate several individual letters, all headed in that general direction, of which only one survived? Did the scribe that took down the dictation make any mistakes? Did he mishear any words? Apologists like Frank Turek will freely admit that there are mistakes in the copies of the books that we have access to today, but then will claim that the originals were infallible. In this case, would the original not be Paul's dictation rather than the scribe's copying of that dictation? Which would mean that, from the very first moment that the ink hit the paper, there were most probably errors in the book. And if it were the same letter sent to multiple churches, did the scribe make mistakes while copying it? This is irrelevant to the current discussion, but it's definitely a thing to think about.
Number 4, a myth requires 2 or more generations to pass before it can take root.
Again, see the examples of Elvis being still alive and the 2020 election. Both took root well before even one generation had passed. Now, this 2-generation claim originates from historian A.N. Sherwin-White in a series of lectures that he later published in book form in the 1960s. The main problem with using the 2-generation rule is that it was never about how long it would take for extra details to be added onto the story, a resurrection for instance. It's actually about how long it would take for the historical core to be completely erased and replaced with myth, as he pointed out in this footnote where he responds to a colleague who used the fact that mythical elements to the story of Alexander the Great cropped up during Alexander's lifetime against it. His response was to point out that, yes, the myth was growing, but the rule holds true because the historical core of the story is still there. So, notably, historians generally reject the 2-generation rule, but even if I grant it, then the best case scenario here is that the historical core, that Jesus was a real apocalyptic rabbi who was executed by crucifixion, is still intact, with its mythical elements starting to grow around it.
And finally, number 5, the best scholarship suggests the Synoptic Gospels were written within 30 years of Calvary.
The best scholarship suggests that the earliest plausible date for the earliest gospel was 32 years after the crucifixion, with the next earliest gospel being the Gospel of Peter, in which a giant Jesus emerges from the tomb being followed by a talking cross. Of course, this is with me taking the earliest plausible dates. The Gospel of Peter may well have been written after the other Gospels, but going by the earliest dates, Peter was the second one to be written, and it was written around the same time as the Egerton Gospel, which is rather like the Synoptics in its content, but with a much different style, leading some scholars to speculate that it was actually written before Mark, and Mark used it as the basis of his story. but stylistic differences have led to the general consensus that Egerton was writing independently, using things like the hypothesized Q source or oral tradition for its base, and whatever source it used was just the same source that Mark would have used, or at least similar. Then comes the Secret Gospel of Mark, possibly written as early as 70 CE, so actually around the same time as Egerton and Peter. Secret Mark is fascinating, as it makes the claim that not Secret Mark is purposefully omitting details of the story, writing to increase faith, without initiating people into the secret mysteries of true Christianity. The author even advises people who know of Secret Mark to lie under oath in order to keep the secret. Now, finally, we get to Matthew and Luke, which, again going by the earliest dates, were written at roughly the same time in 80 CE, 50 or so years after the crucifixion, 20 years later than is being claimed here. And then, around the same time, we have the Gospels of the Hebrews and of the Egyptians. My point in going through all this is to ask, why do we accept the canonical versions of the stories despite their glaring contradictions, but discard the non-canonical ones? Especially when generous estimating has so many of them written around the same time as the canonical ones. I mean, really, if you just want to assume not only the earliest dates, but 20 years earlier than the earliest dates, then what's to stop me from assuming the latest possible dates, which would then have the earliest of the canonical Gospels being written in 80 CE? You can't just spit stuff like this out as though it's basic, widely accepted fact. You have to explain why you're using the estimates that you are choosing to use, especially if you're using estimates that are way outside the consensus of scholars.
All that to say, the people who wrote these accounts claim to have seen them.
Nope. Nowhere in the Gospels does it say that they are eyewitnesses. In fact, the author of Luke goes out of his way in the first chapter and verse to point out that he is compiling a collection of accounts that he has obtained from other sources, the Book of Mark being a pretty big one. Matthew, while it does not flat out admit that it's based on other works, does copy Mark word for word far too frequently. And we're not just talking about a paragraph here and there. Fully 94% of the Book of Mark is copied word for word into the Book of Matthew. If both Matthew and Mark were eyewitnesses, why would Matthew need to copy Mark's work in such detail? Should he not be writing it from his own perspective, as is the excuse that is so often used to dismiss contradictions? And even if we go by church tradition, Mark is supposed to have gotten the information for his gospel from listening to Peter preaching in Rome. So Mark is not even claimed by church tradition to have been an eyewitness. And yet Matthew, the eyewitness, felt the need to copy the story that Mark had written secondhand for some reason? And John gets basic details that any eyewitness should know wrong, such as when it says that Jesus and anyone who confesses him to be the Christ were put out of the synagogue during Jesus' life. Christians were considered both by Jewish leaders and the Roman authorities to have been a sect of Judaism and were allowed within the synagogue until they were expelled sometime after the destruction of the temple in 70 CE, well after Jesus' death. So we've got two non-eyewitnesses, Mark and Luke, with one supposed eyewitness, Matthew, copying off the earlier non-eyewitness, Mark, followed by a book written much later than the other copies, which makes basic mistakes that no eyewitness would make. And the earliest of these was written, best case scenario, 30 years after Jesus' death. And the earliest is the one that isn't even claimed to have been written by an eyewitness to begin with. Forgive me for not being impressed in the slightest.
Furthermore, the details that are given are so rich. Anytime somebody makes up a myth, this guy he died and then he wasn't dead anymore. And they can be extremely vague. Why? Because you can't get busted. But when you've got a lot of details, that tells the reader, either they are a really intricate liar or this really happened.
Or they were just writing down the oral traditions that made it to their various communities, complete with all the varying details. But also, and maybe I'm alone on this, but to me, if someone gives a weirdly specific account of something with all sorts of superfluous details that were not necessary to the story, that raises my suspicions, because it then looks like they're trying to make up extra details to make the lie appear more believable. But like I said, I don't think the gospel authors were lying, I just think they were writing down stories as they were familiar with them. Except maybe John, who wasn't necessarily lying, but he did definitely go out of his way to make sure people couldn't possibly believe the synoptic story over his, What do you mean Simon helped Jesus carry his cross? Jesus is a god, not a man. He doesn't need help. He carried his own cross, damn it. Gethsemane? Jesus asking to have his cup taken away? Unthinkable! Why would God not want to carry out his own plan? Shall I not drink the cup which my Father has given to me? And so on.
From Nathan Busenitz, first century fiction was not written in today's style of realistic narrative. There is no mistaking ancient myth with real history because ancient fiction never wasted time on unnecessary details that didn't drive the plot or promote a character's development.
This isn't a question of genre. The Gospels essentially represented a new genre that had never been done before, though they do seem to be a subcategory of Greco-Roman biography. Notably, Greco-Roman biographies are generally concerned with preserving the teachings and reputation of a notable figure, and as such, they were not overly concerned with what we today would think of as biographical accuracy. That is, the accuracy of the events they depict is less important than the impact their depiction is having on the primary subject's reputation. So with that in mind, we wouldn't assume that they are fiction, but we also shouldn't be assuming that all the details of every story have been accurately conveyed without alteration or exaggeration.
Go ahead and read any one of the mythological accounts of some sort of divine human being, and they do not have the specificity of the resurrection of Jesus Christ.
I'm not going to do a deep dive on the specificity of the Iliad right now. I read it a long time ago, and I seem to recall thinking that they gave a lot of details that weren't really necessary to the plot, but as I'm not really concerned with genre, I don't care, even if you're right. I'm not claiming that the Gospels were written as fictions to begin with.
In 4 accounts, that should give you confidence. This is too detailed from individuals who wrote the accounts too near the event for it to be a myth.
Even if I grant how detailed it is and that they were written within the couple decades that you were claiming, it has no bearing on how true the contents of the books are. Something can be written 20 years after an event and give a very detailed and yet still incorrect account of that event.
More from Dr. Busenitz. Mark 4:38, he cites, Jesus himself was in the stern asleep on the cushion, and they woke him and said to him, Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing? He was in the stern on a cushion. Why the detail?
Are you fucking kidding me? Those are the kinds of details you're getting caught up on? Okay, I lied. I'm opening the Iliad now. From Book 12. Then Neptune and Apollo took counsel to destroy the wall, and they turned onto it the streams of all the rivers from Mount Ida into the seas. Rhesus, Heptaporus, Caresis, Rhodius, Grenicus, Asopus, and goodly Scamander, with Simios, where many a shield and helm had fallen, and many a hero of the race of demigods had bitten the dust. Phoebus Apollo turned the mouths of all these rivers together and made them flow for 9 days against the wall, while Jove reigned the whole time that he might wash it sooner into the sea. Neptune himself, trident in hand, surveyed the work and threw into the sea all the foundations of beams and stones which the Achaeans had laid down with so much toil. He made all level by the mighty stream of the Hellespont, and then when he had swept the wall away and spread the great beach of sand over the place where it had been, this done, he turned the rivers back to their old courses. Yes, I know I pronounced half of that wrong, and I don't care right now. My point is, why the need to name all the rivers? Why mention that Neptune had his trident in his hand, since, he always has his trident? Why so specific about the rivers flowing for 9 days against the wall? Why the aside about the soldiers who died apparently in or near the Simois? All of these details are at least as superfluous as Jesus being in the stern and on a cushion. I'm skipping the rest of the precise details that he gives. They are all equally unimpressive and would have fit right into a fictional narrative.
The written eyewitness accounts are too self-debasing and counterproductive to be a myth.
This is the criterion of embarrassment, right?
Imagine you desired to be rich and famous and to have a lot of followers, and you were willing to write down details of your experiences following a poor Nazarene around Israel. Would you describe yourself as a buffoon?
No, but as we've already discussed, the disciples were not the authors of the book. The stupidity of the disciples is likely a literary device. In the case of Mark, he was emphasizing the mystery surrounding Jesus. His book is the key to unlocking that mystery, and the disciples are the backdrop against which these mysteries are explained. If they just understood everything right from the get-go, then Jesus wouldn't have to spell it out in a way that the reader would understand. I think we can skip his condescending, "But why would they make themselves look bad in their own books?" section, as we've already established that none of them are actually written by eyewitnesses, making this whole thing a moot point.
An appeal to a woman's testimony, which in those days was not admissible in court.
The resurrection claim was never put on trial in a court, so I don't really understand the relevance of this whole thing about the woman's testimony not being valuable in court. It's a story. If you want a story to be believable, you include believable details. It even lays this out plainly in the non-canonical Gospel of Peter, pointing out that the women had been delayed in being able to do those things that women are wont to do at the sepulchre. There were jobs that women were expected to do regarding the preparation of dead bodies. The women were on their way to do those jobs when they discovered that the body was missing. To have the men there on their way to do women's work would have been very much out of place. Also, I know I skipped most of this section, though I couldn't resist commenting on the women at the tomb thing, but this whole section relies heavily on the assumption that you even know what would be considered embarrassing or shameful to a person who lived in a different time, a different culture, different life experiences from you. How do you know that a portrayal of women doing women's work would have been embarrassing to the early Christians? How do you know that the author of the Gospels would have been embarrassed about Peter denying Jesus? Would the authors not rather be emphasizing how impressive it is that Jesus' prediction of Peter's betrayal came true? Same for anything that you are claiming they would have been embarrassed about. The fact of the matter is, we are assuming embarrassment based on our cultural expectations. I don't have enough data to accurately judge embarrassment based on the author's culture or experiences, especially given the fact that the authors are anonymous. And that's gonna do it for this one. As predicted, no new arguments, I'm still an atheist, and these were indeed the type of argument that falls apart the more you learn about the subject that they're talking about. Today's comment of the day comes to us from Mega Meow, who says, "Love your point about Jesus' teachings being meh and not unique. As Rabbi Tuvia Singer says, anything true in the New Testament is not new, and anything new in the New Testament is not true." I love that quote, though I do feel like Rabbi Singer and I would probably disagree about what details in the New Testament are considered true. Also, this was a super easy quote to find a clip of him actually saying, so I appreciate that and will probably use this clip at least on occasion.
Anything true in the New Testament isn't new, but anything new in the New Testament isn't true.
Thanks for watching. Special thanks as always to my patrons, iOS Tilt Bill Gamer, Bryn Pound, Clench Eastwood, Lynn Dobbs, Mark McManus, Mark Hetcham, and all the rest, who are the two E's in the judgment that is my channel. No, I will not let that go. If you'd like to be completely necessary with the spelling of the word making zero sense unless both of you are there, you can join us on Patreon for as little as $1 per week over at patreon.com/ViceRhino. If you feel so inclined, you can also support the channel through direct donation or my Amazon wishlist. Links to social media, all the ways to support the channel, and to my other projects can be found at links.vicerhino.com. If for whatever reason you want to send me stuff, my P.O. Box address is in the description. See you next time!